I walked into that classroom expecting typical high school drama, but what I found was a chilling, organized silence that made my blood run cold. And now that the principal is facing charges and the entire town is in an uproar, I have to ask you, would you have broken the silence, or would you have stayed quiet to protect yourself? Imagine a place where half the population is literally forbidden from making a sound, enforced by a twisted social hierarchy and a faculty that looks the other way. And tell me if I was the villain for burning that system to the ground. My name is Maya, and my family moved to Oakhaven last fall because my dad got a promotion that seemed like a dream come true, but looking back, I wish we had never seen that welcome sign. Oakhaven is one of those perfect-looking towns where every lawn is manicured, and every house has a wraparound porch. But the atmosphere at Oakhaven Private Academy was different from the second I stepped through the gates. I noticed it in the hallways first. The boys were loud, shoving each other, shouting across the lockers and laughing, but the girls were like ghosts. They moved in perfect, straight lines, eyes glued to the floor, clutching their books to their chests as if they were shields. I thought maybe it was just a weirdly disciplined school, but when I tried to ask a girl near my locker where the administration office was, she didn't just ignore me. She looked at me with pure, unadulterated terror, pressed her finger to her lips, and practically ran away. I stood there, totally confused, thinking I must have had something on my face, or that she was just incredibly shy. My first class was AP History, and that's when the reality of the situation started to sink in. The teacher, Mr. Sterling, was middle-aged with a sharp, pinched face and a voice like gravel. He started the lesson by asking a question about the Industrial Revolution. I raised my hand immediately, being the overachiever I am, but the entire room went dead silent. Mr. Sterling didn't even look at me. He waited until a guy in the back named Caleb, who looked like he hadn't opened a book in 3 years, muttered a half-correct answer. Sterling beamed, praised him like he'd discovered fire, and moved on. I thought it was a fluke, so I cleared my throat and said, "Actually, wasn't the impact on urban migration more significant than the textile shift?" The moment my voice hit the air, every single person in that room froze. The girls looked like they were expecting a bomb to go off, and the boys all turned to look at me with these smirks that made my skin crawl. Mr. Sterling walked over to my desk, leaned down until his face was inches from mine, and whispered that in this academy, we value the natural order of quietude for female students to ensure a focused learning environment. I was floored. I asked him what that even meant, and he just handed me a detention slip without a word. By lunchtime, I was fuming. I went to the cafeteria, which was the weirdest sight I've ever seen. One side of the room was a chaotic mess of guys throwing food and shouting, while the other side was filled with girls eating in absolute, harrowing silence. Not a whisper. Not a giggle. Nothing. I sat down next to a girl named Sarah, who I'd seen in my morning class, and leaned in close. I asked her what the hell was going on, and why everyone was acting like they were in a cult. Sarah didn't look up from her salad, but I saw her hands trembling so hard she dropped her fork. She took a small piece of paper from her pocket, scribbled "They watch the cameras," and pushed it toward me before getting up and leaving. I looked up and realized the cafeteria was lined with high-tech cameras, and there were senior boys, members of something called the Proctorate, walking the aisles with tablets, taking notes. I learned later that these proctors were given the power to dock behavioral points from girls for any verbal infraction, and those points determined everything from your grades to whether or not you were allowed to participate in extracurriculars. It was a systematic silencing of every female voice in the school, orchestrated by the headmaster, Dr. Thorne, who believed that traditional values meant women should be seen and not heard. He had even convinced the parents that this silence initiative was a way to boost focus and mental clarity. It was brainwashing, plain and simple. For the first week, I tried to play along just to see how deep it went, but the more I saw, the more disgusted I became. I saw a girl get a 3-day suspension just for sneezing too loudly and saying "excuse me." I saw the way the boys talked about the girls right in front of them, saying the most horrific, degrading things, knowing the girls couldn't talk back or defend themselves. It was a power trip on a massive scale. To make matters worse, the psychological warfare was constant. In the hallways, the proctors would deliberately trip girls or drop their books just to see if they would cry out in surprise or pain. If a girl so much as gasped, A proctor would tap his tablet, and her digital file would be flagged. I watched as girls I knew were brilliant and vibrant turned into hollow shells of themselves. They developed a language of eyes. A quick glance to the left meant a teacher was coming. A squint meant danger. A wide-eyed stare meant, "Don't speak to me." It was like living in a high-budget horror movie, but there were no credits rolling. I tried to talk to my parents about it, but Thorne was a master manipulator. He had held orientation nights, where he showed doctored statistics claiming that female students at Oakhaven had 40% higher test scores because they weren't distracted by social chatter. My parents, wanting the best for my education, told me I was just experiencing culture shock, and that I should try to appreciate the discipline. They didn't see the bruises on the girls' spirits. They didn't see the way the reflection chamber in the basement was always occupied. I decided I had to see that chamber for myself. One evening, I stayed late under the guise of finishing a project in the library. I crept toward the basement stairs, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. The air grew colder the deeper I went. The reflection chamber wasn't just a room. It was a sensory deprivation tank for the soul. I peered through a small glass slit in one of the heavy steel doors, and saw a girl named Emily sitting perfectly still in the dark. A speaker in the corner was looping Dr. Thorne's voice at a low, vibrating frequency, reciting a manifesto about the purity of the quiet vessel. It was pure, unadulterated torture disguised as pedagogy. I realized then that this wasn't just a school rule. It was a factory designed to produce submissive wives for the town's elite. The Proctorate boys weren't just students. They were being trained as the next generation of oppressors. The leader of the proctors, a senior named Marcus, caught me near the basement. He didn't report me immediately. Instead, he pinned me against the wall and whispered that he liked the feisty ones, because it was more fun to break them. He told me that by graduation, I'd be just as silent and obedient as the rest of them, or I'd be gone. That was the spark that turned my fear into a blazing fire of rage. I started small. I began leaving the resistance notes in the most daring places, taped to the inside of toilet stalls, tucked into the pockets of gym hoodies, and even slipped into the grading folders of the few teachers I thought might still have a conscience. I realized that the girls weren't just silent. They were waiting for a leader. They were waiting for someone to prove that the sky wouldn't fall if they opened their mouths. I began organizing the silent sit-ins during the midnight hours at a local park. We would meet under the cover of darkness, and for the first time, these girls would talk. They would scream into pillows, they would tell stories of their dreams, of wanting to be doctors, engineers, and pilots, dreams that Oakhaven was trying to choke out of them. We spent hundreds of hours recording testimony. I bought a dozen cheap burner phones and distributed them among the core group. We became a shadow network. We documented every infraction, every time a proctor used physical force to enforce quietude, and every time Dr. Thorne used school funds to upgrade the surveillance system rather than buying new textbooks. We found out that Thorne was actually receiving grant money from a shadowy traditionalist foundation to test this educational model before pitching it to other private schools across the country. We weren't just fighting for our school. We were fighting to stop a plague from spreading. The tension in the school became a physical weight. The boys knew something was up. They could feel the shift in the girls' eyes. We weren't looking at the floor anymore. We were looking at them, and for the first time, they were the ones who looked uncomfortable. Marcus started following me everywhere, his tablet always open, his finger hovering over the report button, but I was careful. I communicated in code, using a series of hand signals that looked like nervous habits, but were actually complex instructions for our upcoming vocal strike. We knew the annual Founders Gala was the only moment where the school's armor was thin. The local media would be there, and the donors who liked to pretend they were philanthropists wouldn't be able to ignore a public scandal. So that's the situation I was in. I was a 17-year-old girl up against an entire institution, a town of complicit parents, and a system designed to crush my spirit. I had all the evidence I needed to destroy them, but I knew that doing so would mean I'd probably never be able to show my face in Oakhaven again. And my dad's career would be ruined because he worked for one of the school's biggest donors. I had to make a choice. Do I stay quiet to protect my family's future? Or do I burn it all down for the sake of every girl in that school? Before I tell you what happened next and how the great silence finally ended, I want you to pause and comment below what you would have done in my shoes. Would you have risked everything to speak up, or would you have kept your head down? The day of the annual Founders Gala was our deadline. This was the biggest event of the year, where all the wealthy donors, the town mayor, and the local news crews showed up to celebrate the school's success. Dr. Thorne was on stage, giving a speech about how Oakhaven was a bastion of traditional excellence, and how our silent girls were a testament to the discipline he had instilled. He looked so smug in his tuxedo, sipping champagne while he talked about us like we were trained animals. As he reached the climax of his speech, I signaled the girls. We were all positioned around the ballroom, looking like perfect, obedient dolls in our formal dresses. Suddenly, I stood up on my chair and pulled out a megaphone I'd hidden under my skirt, taped to my thigh. I didn't say a word at first. I just played the recording I'd taken in the basement. The sound of the reflection chamber hummed through the expensive speakers of the ballroom, followed by Dr. Thorne's voice, clear as a bell, explaining to a donor how the girls are easier to manage when they forget they have a voice. The room went dead. Thorne's face turned a shade of purple I didn't think was humanly possible. He lunged for the microphone, but I was faster. I screamed at the top of my lungs, "We are not silent." It was the loudest sound I'd ever made. On cue, 50 girls stood up simultaneously. We didn't scream, and we didn't shout insults. We started reciting the names of every woman in history who had been silenced, our voices rising in a unified, deafening roar. Amelia Earhart, Rosa Parks, Malala Yousafzai. It was like a wave of sound that crashed over the audience, shattering the expensive glassware and the even more expensive lies. The proctors, led by Marcus, tried to rush us, to physically drag us out of the room, but we had anticipated that. The girls formed a human chain, locking arms, a wall of living, breathing, shouting humanity. The parents in the audience, some of whom had been brainwashed, others who were just willfully ignorant, were frozen in shock. I saw mothers looking at their daughters as if they were seeing them for the first time. I saw a news reporter frantically signaling his cameraman to get closer. I marched up to the stage, dodging a frantic Mr. Sterling, and grabbed the main podium mic. I looked Thorne dead in the eye, the megaphone still in my other hand, and I told him, "You didn't teach us silence. You just taught us how to wait for our turn to speak. And Thorne, your turn is over." I then flipped the switch on a projector I'd hacked into earlier that day. The giant screen behind him, which was supposed to show a slideshow of school achievements, instead played a montage of the reflection chamber, the hidden camera footage of Proctor's bullying girls, and the financial records of the Traditionalist Foundation grants. It was a total public execution of his reputation. The aftermath was total chaos. The news cameras caught everything, and the live stream I'd set up through a burner phone had already reached 3 million viewers by the time the police arrived. The Silence Initiative was exposed for what it was, a massive violation of civil rights, psychological abuse, and a criminal conspiracy. Dr. Thorne was arrested that night, not just for the school policies, but for the illegal surveillance of minors and the misappropriation of funds. The Proctorate was disbanded, and Marcus and several other senior boys were expelled and faced harassment charges. My dad did lose his job because his boss was the one who had been funding Thorne's reflection chamber project, but he didn't care. When he picked me up from the police station after I gave my statement, he just hugged me and whispered, "Thank you for finding your voice, Maya. I'm sorry I ever asked you to be quiet." We ended up moving to a different state, but the impact stayed behind. Oakhaven Academy was shut down for a full year for a total cultural overhaul. It reopened as a public charter school with a curriculum focused on debate, public speaking, and civil rights. The Reflection Chamber was turned into a recording studio for the school's new podcasting club. Sarah and the other girls still text me every day. They send me voice memos of themselves singing, laughing, and just talking about their days. Small things that most people take for granted, but to us, they are miracles. I still have nightmares about the silence sometimes, the way it felt like a cold hand around my throat. But then I remember the sound of 50 voices rising together in that ballroom, and I realize that silence is only powerful when people are afraid to break it. I learned that silence isn't a virtue when it's forced upon you. It's a prison. And the only way to break out of a prison like that is to find your voice and use it like a hammer until the walls come tumbling down. Looking back on that year, I realized that people will always try to tell you to be quiet when they are afraid of what you have to say. They want you to be small, predictable, and silent because it makes them feel powerful. But your voice is the most dangerous weapon you own, and you should never, ever let someone take it away from you. If you ever find yourself in a room where you're told that your silence is your best quality, that is your cue to speak as loudly as you possibly can. Like this video if you were on my side and think those teachers got what they deserved. Subscribe for more stories like this where we expose the truth, no matter how shocking it is. And please share your final thoughts on this whole mess in the comments section. Did I go too far, or was the great silence something that needed to be destroyed at any cost? I'll see you all in the next story.